Hello, everyone who's joining us. We're going to give another minute or so for people to get logged on since our start time is 11 a.m. and I have 10:59 on my clock. And then we will get started. Alrighty, let's get going. So welcome to the weekly webinar series presented by the California Department of Social Services, Office of Child Abuse Prevention, in partnership with the Child Abuse Prevention Center and the California Training Institute. We are so glad to have you joining us today. Today's topic is redesigning child welfare around prevention, equity, and well-being. And this is part one of our series with Claire Anderson and Dawn Winstead. Just a few housekeeping things. As you can see, I see a lot of you have found you're introducing yourselves in the chat, which is great. We will also have a question and answer portion of today's webinar. And in the question and answer period, we do ask that you use the Q&A tab down at the bottom of your Zoom controls. But to save any logistical questions or issues for the chat. So the Q&A will be for questions for our wonderful speakers, and the chat will be for talking amongst yourselves, any networking, and if you have any logistical questions, you can message me. My name is Bryn Pascal. I am with the Child Abuse Prevention Center, and I will be here for any technological issues you may be having today. So feel free to send me a direct message and let me know if there's anything you need from me. And now I will be passing over the torch to Cheryl Treadwell to share a little bit more.
Good morning, everyone. As she said, welcome to our second session of the Child Abuse Prevention Month Speaker Series. I am Cheryl Treadwell. I am the Chief of the Safety Prevention and Early Intervention Branch at the California Department of Social Services. And I have the pleasure of introducing Claire Anderson from Chapin Hall, Don Winstead from the Don Winstead Consulting. Claire and Don will tap into the lessons learned from our last presenter, Michael Finley from the W. Hayward Burns Institute. Michael provided us with the historical context for structural racism and the current day implications for the work that we're doing. As stated by Bryn, Claire and Don's presentation will focus on redesigning child welfare around prevention, equity, and well-being, and is an opportunity for us to learn about the science of economic and concrete supports, the impact that these safety net programs have on reducing child welfare system involvement. So without further delay, let's begin the presentation, and I thank you all for joining this morning.
Terrific. Thank you so much. We are, Dawn and I are delighted to be here today, and we are thrilled to be able to talk with you a little bit about economic and concrete supports as a prevention and intervention strategy. So I'm Claire Anderson. I'm a senior policy fellow at Chapin Hall. And Dawn, could I have you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Don Winstead. I'm a consultant, and I worked for many years with the state of Florida, and my experience there was with the State Department of Children and Families, and also worked for a while at HHS in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation in Washington. And for the past 11 years or so, I've been consulting, much of the consulting with states, counties, and tribes around child welfare and child welfare financing in conjunction with Casey Family Programs, and really appreciate Casey's support of this effort.
Yeah, absolutely. Casey Family Programs has also supported Chapin Hall to provide support in terms of Family First in California and over time in Los Angeles. And we are quite grateful for their ongoing support. Like Don, I spent a little bit of time at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services as the Deputy Commissioner at the Administration on Children, Youth, and Families. And I think us bringing you today both a national perspective in terms of working with states across the country, but also understanding a little bit about how federal policymaking works and the intersection of various systems and policies, I think has led us both to think a great deal about economic and concrete supports across the benefit platform and beyond. My colleague Yasmin Graywall-Koch is also in attendance today, and she will be joining you at the end of the sessions for the panel in my stead. And she and I together have been doing a great deal of exploration of the science of economic and concrete supports and co-leading our work here at Chapin Hall in this space, and we hope to bring much of that to you here today. Thank you for having us, and Dawn, thank you for partnering with us today to bring this information to you. And Cheryl, you also indicated the reminder of the presentation that this group has heard last week from the W. Haywood Burns Institute. It's critically important content and sets the context for much of what we are going to be talking about today. And we hope to pull some of those historical threads here at the beginning of the presentation, just to ground us in the historical child welfare context as it relates to race equity and beyond. So we'll start out by letting you know that these slides will be available to you. An abbreviated slide deck is available at this link, along with a narrative brief that we encourage you to take a look at, but you'll also have access to this slide deck as well. Not only is Chapin Hall writing about the provision of economic and concrete supports as a prevention strategy, we also are seeing other organizations do so as well. Prevent Child Abuse, and its recently released federal policy agenda calls for prioritizing and increasing economic and concrete supports for families. Casey Family Programs recently released a brief on the topic, and we'll talk a little bit later in the presentation about the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Center for Disease Control, and certainly these recommendations in our presentation today would not be possible without the depth of research from a number of incredibly committed researchers across the country over the last 20 years, really trying to understand and point us towards a deeper understanding of the role of economic and concrete supports as a key factor in whether or not families become involved in child welfare. And certainly the National Academy of Sciences has looked at child poverty specifically. And Don sat on a committee at the Academy, and I just want to have you talk a little bit here about the connection about child poverty more specifically, as then we will zoom back in on economic and concrete supports in child welfare.
Yeah, our work on the Academy, and there was a committee that was formed. It was subsequent to direction from Congress, so it was a congressionally authorized study, and they asked us, or asked the Academy, to pull together a group to look at issues of child poverty and come up with some strategies that would potentially have the effect of reducing child poverty by 50% over 10 years. That was our charge. And what we found from a very in-depth, and we even produced a book, you'll see, that that contains an awful lot of summation of the research here. And we found so many of the issues that face families that are involved in the child welfare system, particularly related to issues of neglect, derived from child poverty, not only chronic child poverty, but also deep child poverty, families below 50% of the poverty level. And I'll talk a little bit more as we go forward about some of the recommendations and the ideas that came out of that study. So in terms of historical context, a few years ago, I had the opportunity to participate in a discussion. Some folks from the United States and some folks from the United Kingdom got together in the UK to talk about poverty issues. And as often the case, the US group, we started our discussion about mothers' pensions and the Social Security Act. This is the slide that our colleagues from the UK started with. And so first of all, I apologize for the language, the inappropriate historical language, but it makes the point that the issues that we're talking about here are not new issues. But during the reign of Edward VI, when this slide first was created, since that time, at least, we've been better at classifying poverty than we have at solving it. But of course, Edward, if you're familiar with your English history, you'll know that this was probably staff work and not Edward's work himself, because in 1553, he was 15 years old and was quite sickly and died later that year. So, but it was part of the discussion that led to the English or Elizabethan poor laws, shown here in the lower right, Elizabeth I. And the Elizabethan poor laws, just as English common law really in many ways set the structure of American laws, the English or Elizabethan poor laws laid out a structure for social services that sounds pretty familiar once you get past the strange language. The Elizabethan poor laws essentially said people who can work should work, people who can't work should be cared for in community, and people who can't be cared for in community should be receive institutional care. Now, in those days, that was called workhouses, almshouses, and asylums. And the conditions were often very brutal. But if you think about our structure of social services today, it's pretty familiar context. Next slide. Another just point in time that I wanted to highlight, and then Claire will give a little bit broader context, moving forward to 1960, was the development of the Fleming Rule. And the Fleming Rule occurred, there was a trigger event. Louisiana was sort of the trigger for it, although it certainly was not the only state that had this kind of policies. These were unfortunately quite common. But Louisiana expelled 23,000 children, mostly Black, from its welfare rolls because their homes were unsuitable. And at that time, there was an unsuitability or suitability of homes doctrine in AFDC policy. And at that time, the secretary of then the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, the gentleman shown on the left there, Dr. Fleming, Dr. Arthur Fleming said, no, that's not right. And he put in place some emergency rules and said that if a child, if you're going to remove the child from welfare because the home's not suitable, you have to do one of two things: either provide services to make the home suitable, or to provide a suitable placement while continuing to provide financial support for the child. Two things notable about this. One is that people wonder where this strange financial eligibility in 4E came from, and why in the world 4E eligibility today is based on old AFDC eligibility standards. This is where it came from, because child welfare entitlement came out of AFDC. Second point to make is that while the entitlement as it came out of AFDC was for the financial support for the out-of-home care placement, the provision of suitable placements didn't have that uncapped federal entitlement. So that just as we've had until recently with the Family First Act, there was federal support for children who were removed from their homes, but not necessarily federal support at the uncapped entitlement level in order to provide services for the home to be suitable. I'll turn back to Claire now, and she'll give you a little bit broader overall context.
So when you think about that, I'm just going to put a pin in what Don just said. So the Fleming Rule was created, and a year later, the Social Security Act was amended to create an uncapped entitlement for Part 2, removing the child and placing them in foster care, but did not create analogous funding for Part 1 of the Fleming Rule, which was to provide supports to families to further make the home suitable in the language of the time and the law. So that represents this bifurcation, this separating of economic and concrete supports for supporting families from the economic supports and policies designed to keep children safe. And we see that repeating itself often across the child welfare policy paradigm. It is core at this point to the child welfare policy paradigm, one might say, to not include economic and concrete supports as a strategy to prevent children from being removed from their home in the child welfare policy context. We see that, Don mentioned the mother's pensions. We see that early on in the mother's pensions, and we see that up to the most recent piece of legislation in the Family First Prevention Services Act, where mental health, substance abuse, and parenting programs are allowable services, and there is not an inclusion of economic and concrete supports as part of the explicit set of services that can be provided. So we think that this is important for people to understand in terms of policy context, because it can, in naming the problem, provide a pathway for a change in the policy context. So let's go to the next slide. And this bifurcation has created, we think, a cascading effect of economic hardship, not only in child welfare, but in the broader economic and concrete support context across the country. Paired with what we have as a pretty fragmented human service system with various eligibility criteria, various ways in which programs are accessed. Through CAPTA, we have mandated reporting laws and the identification of a very broad swath of mandated reporters, and a deficit-based, rigid and set of piecemeal policies that create a context in which there is not sufficient economic and concrete supports for families to be stable. We think that causes some overload of families, some destabilization effect, where there are unmet service and support needs, then high rates of reported neglect, then involvement with child welfare. But we think that the intersection of family economic insecurity, income, and involvement with child welfare, that we can actually learn a lot from the evidence base and the science that has been emerging over the last 20 plus years. We know that about 60% of substantiated CPS responses nationally involve neglect only. But we also know, and you'll see throughout the course of this presentation and the next one, that the provision of economic and concrete supports is correlated with reductions in involvement in child welfare, both for neglect and for physical abuse. So this is a nuanced conversation. This is not just that we substantiate for neglect and it's actually just poverty. There's a lot that's in the box of neglect. We find substance abuse, mental health, domestic violence. Other things are in the box of neglect, and we've got physical abuse. And I think that what you'll see through the evidence is when you take economic and concrete supports from families, they have increased involvement with child welfare. And when you provide economic and concrete supports, we're seeing decrease. So they're correlated. We don't well understand yet for which family, at what time, and at what amount this effect is happening. And we don't have a tremendous amount of causal evidence, though we have some nascent evidence. And so we're going to try and explore a little bit of that with you today and next week. Nearly half of all states do not exempt families' financial inability to provide for their children from their definition of neglect. And if we're coming at the presentation today from a policy lens and policy opportunities, California presently does not exempt families' inability to financially provide for their kids from their definition of neglect. So a policy opportunity there. But we also know that even if you do create a policy in this respect, that it is not an immediate or a silver bullet. There are a number of things that need to be contained in the broader policy array. But we think that policies are important, and how we construct them matters for kids and families. The rates of neglect over time are also very interesting. This graph has been modified from the core numbers so that physical abuse and sex abuse are multiplied so that we can see them better relative to neglect. If this were each of the numbers at 100%, we all know that physical abuse and sex abuse are a much lower percentage and would be far down on the axis if the numbers were not multiplied. But looking at it in this way is very interesting. We see that both physical abuse and sex abuse have had a pretty precipitous drop off over time. But our rates of neglect have not changed, leading us, I think, to hypothesize that our current set of interventions are not yet having the effect that we hope for them to have, or if that hypothesis is not accurate, perhaps a hypothesis around a new set of strategies that we might need to deploy to begin to have an effect here in this space. We do know that economic insecurity is associated with child welfare involvement. Children in economically insecure households are 5 times more likely to experience maltreatment and 7 times more likely to experience neglect. Once you move from the general population and the risk pool, and you look at families who are investigated by CPS, nearly 85% of families investigated by CPS earn below 200% of the federal poverty line. So this our child protective services component of our broad system is deployed primarily with families under 200% of the federal poverty line. And then once we get to substantiations, families living below the poverty line at 100% of the poverty line are 3 times more likely to be substantiated for neglect, for child maltreatment. And we also see something really interesting happening when we look at material hardship. One material hardship, at least one, the likelihood of being investigated for neglect increases by 3%. And for physical abuse investigation, it increases nearly 4%. So remember when I was saying at the very beginning, we're seeing something happening not just in neglect, but also in physical abuse. And if families experience multiple types of hardship after experiencing no hardships, their risk increases even more. A CPS investigation risk increases by 4%, and a physical abuse investigation increases by 7%. So there's something that's happening in this space where families are kind of experiencing this turbulence or these income shocks or shocks related to material hardship and coming in and out of that space. I'm going to have you start on the right side of this slide. Our strongest predictors of investigated neglect reports generally include things like cutting meals and food pantry use, so food insecurity, things related to their housing stability, like short duration of residence, difficulty paying rent, utility shutoff, and inability to pay for a medical bill, for example, for a family member. And we also see public benefits show up here, though we have complex data about public benefit. It can also be quite protective. And there's a hypothesis here that this is more about families having more touch points and therefore might be involved in neglect reports more often. But you'll see quite clearly that public benefits can be quite protective. If you look at the left-hand side of the slide, our most reliable economic predictors of child welfare involvement include income loss, cumulative material hardship, and housing hardship. So this earning shocks or income shocks are associated with increased risk for subsequent child welfare involvement. So for low-income families who already have a closed CPS investigation, experiencing a negative earning shock increases their risk of a subsequent CPS investigation by 18% and increases risk of physical abuse investigation by 26%. And each additional earnings income shock is associated with a 15% greater likelihood of a CPS involvement. But each consecutive quarter with stable income is associated with a 5% lower risk of CPS involvement. And this is about public benefits being protective. So or buffering the effects of these income shocks. For low-income families with a recently closed case, so same study, research suggests that accessing sufficient benefits can effectively buffer against the risk of child maltreatment. And this association is particularly strong for families with young children. And we see about a 12% decrease in risk for CPS involvement and a 50% decrease in risk for physical abuse investigation. We see some interesting things happening as it relates to unemployment. A 1% increase in the monthly unemployment rate in an urban Midwestern county is associated with an increase of 61 screened in child maltreatment reports. These were not neglect only, so this is a predictive study. And a 1% increase in a county unemployment rate is associated with about a 20% increase in substantiated neglect reports. During the Great Recession, the rate of abusive head trauma for children under the age of 5 was significantly higher than the period immediately before the Great Recession, 2007 to 2009. So we see pretty interesting increases in that. And increased male unemployment rates are associated with increased child maltreatment. Declines in male employment specifically is associated with increased child maltreatment. And we see about a 1% increase in a mass layoff of men is associated with an increase in child maltreatment rate by about 4 to 13%. Okay, I'm going to take a quick drink of water and talk a little bit about context. And this will tie back into the information that Don is going to talk about later as it relates to child poverty. We understand economic insecurity to be widespread. About 50% of American families with young children are at risk of poverty before their child enters kindergarten. More than 50% of all Americans will spend a year in poverty. And for Black Americans, about 84% will spend a year in poverty, both by age 65. This data around families moving in and out of poverty over time is important because I think it's actionable for us as we try and figure out where and when and how to insert economic and concrete supports. Almost 50% of those who become poor are out of poverty a year later. So it is possible to be in poverty and then not be in poverty. It's important for us to understand. But 50%, about half of the people who leave poverty will return to poverty within 5 years. And there's some beginning thinking that this turbulence or transitory nature of coming in and out of poverty may be creating serious stressors for families and impacting parenting. About 37% of all US adults do not have $400 in the bank to cover an unexpected expense. And we think that if you look at the family stress model, in this context, it makes a lot of sense, though I'm going to talk about that and then I'm going to have a caveat here. Economic and material hardship can lead to psychological distress and high cognitive loads. It really drains our mental resources. I don't know if any of us experienced that during the pandemic. Certainly, I think it is a more well understood phenomenon over the past 2 years, creating increased conflict or hostility in relationships, less nurturing or responsive kinds of interpersonal interactions and supportive parenting, which can lead to a higher risk of child abuse and neglect. This model, I think, fits quite nicely. I also want to caveat and say that I think that we also have to think about this truly at a systems level as well, that much of our child welfare policy framework directs individually targeted interventions to individuals to ameliorate some perceived deficit or pathology or problem, without fully taking into consideration the broader context that we were just talking about. And so I think that marrying an individually focused theory with a broader contextual theory to help us understand, economic theory, to help us understand what's happening is important. This is just a nice visual of the overloaded family metaphor that many of us are talking about. These are the boxes represent the data I showed you earlier about the predictors of involvement with child welfare, general predictors for involvement for neglect, and economic predictors. And this really helps us understand this from a metaphorical standpoint. Our vehicles, our trucks have a specific payload. You know, they can carry 5,000 pounds. If you put 8,000 pounds on a truck, it is beyond its payload. It becomes overloaded and it does not function as intended. And I think we see this happening with families, and it's, I think, a really nice way for us to begin to talk about what's happening without blaming parents for any individual thing that is happening in their family, because this contextual piece is also co-occurring. We also want to just talk a bit about race equity and the disparities that we see upstream in Black and Brown communities that help us understand the disparities and disproportionality that we see at the front door of child welfare. So in the context that we're describing here and what you heard from the Burns Institute, we see that poverty and economic hardship puts families at increased risk of child welfare involvement, and families of color are more likely to experience economic hardship, and this may contribute to their disproportionate child welfare involvement. And so we do think that economic and concrete supports can be a race equity strategy because it can help stabilize families and prevent child welfare system involvement, and may reduce the disproportionality that we all are quite concerned about. Families of color are more likely to experience poverty. While this is an important statistic, and I'm gonna put a pin in it, I want you to pay attention here, because we're gonna look at our child welfare disproportionality in a minute, and it's gonna look a little familiar, I think. While 14% of the US children are Black, they make up 27% of children living below the poverty line. Children in Black and Latinx households are more likely to experience net worth poverty. And when we look at median net worth in the US, the racial wealth gap further exacerbates the consequences of economic insecurity for families of color. White families have about $190,000 in median net worth compared to about $24,000 for Black families. The median wealth of a young Black family is $600. So let's talk a little bit about disproportionality, both in, I just have this one slide in California. So my national slide is not here, but I think you'll see this irrespective. So more than a quarter of all children born in California are investigated by CPS for alleged maltreatment based on a 1999 birth cohort. Black and Native American children experience CPS involvement at more than 2 times the rate of white children, and approximately half of all Black children, about 47%, and 50% of Native American children are investigated at least once by CPS by the time they're 18, and 72% of all Black children in Los Angeles County experience an investigation. So we see this disproportionality in child welfare, but we also have to have that in the context of what we are seeing upstream as it relates to family economic security or insecurity. We also, zooming back out, this recent brief by the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard about moving upstream and confronting racism to support child development. This is not specific to child welfare, but I think an important reminder that an intentional upstream focus on a broad range of socioeconomic conditions is critical, and this includes equitable access to assets, opportunities in education, employment, housing, health promoting environments, and wealth creation, and that policies that provide economic support to families should be strengthened. Okay, Dawn, I'm going to have you hop in here.
Okay, great. Thank you, Claire. So next slide. So I mentioned earlier about the report, the 2019 report by the National Academies. I should say a couple of things. First of all, for those of you in California, should know that California was well represented on the committee. The committee consisted of 15 eminent poverty scholars, or I should say 14 eminent poverty scholars and me. Well, actually, there were a couple of think tank and practitioner voices there, but a lot of really top quality academics also, two of which, in fact, the chair of the committee was Professor Greg Duncan. Greg is a noted economist from the University of California at Irvine. He was the chair of the committee, and one of the other scholars on the committee was Hillary Hoynes from UC Berkeley, who's also an economist. So your state was well represented around the table as we looked at these issues. Next slide. So we looked, and our charge was to assess what was happening in the country, to look at all of the evidence-based material that we could assemble, and from that to come up with an assessment of, was there a collection of policies or programs that could have the result of reducing child poverty by 50% over 10 years, using the supplemental poverty measure as our yardstick. And with that, we looked at 4 packages of programmatic things. The Congress and our instruction or our task was to rely heavily on existing programs, and could we modify existing programs to come up with the desired results. So this shows the areas that we kind of broke things out for analytic purposes. And next slide, this just shows you all the individual policies and programs that we looked at in different options. So we looked at, can you modify the earned income tax credit? Can you make changes to childcare, alter the minimum wage? Look at a program called Work Advance, where there was some good literature around changes to the SNAP program, housing vouchers, SSI, child allowance, and we looked at the experience of Canada and some other countries there with various forms of child allowances, ways to restructure child support, and also looking at immigration policy. So we looked at all of those things in some detail. We were aided in our examination. There is a micro simulation model that is maintained with support from the federal government by Urban Institute called TRIM3. And TRIM takes CPS data and puts it in a very sophisticated database, and you can run hypothetical analyses from that. And we relied very much on that micro simulation model to tweak and say, what if we did this? What if we did that? What would be the result on income, and what would also be the result on employment? So if you go to the next slide. So we found that there were packages that we could put together that would meet the goal of reducing child poverty by 50%. First, we looked at just a work-oriented package, and would that get you there? And the answer was no. Although it was the least expensive, it didn't get you there. Then we looked at some other supports and all. And finally, we looked at 2 packages of things that included means-tested supports and modification to means-tested programs and work, and 2 different versions of that, one with a means-tested program and one with more universal supports rather than means-tested, with work features built into both of those. And if you look along the bottom there, you see that we found from our micro simulations that package 3, the means-tested supports and work package, resulted in a 50% reduction in poor children, 51.7% reduction of children in deep poverty, which we defined as below 50% of the poverty level, and increases in employment at a pretty substantial cost. But if you think of some of the recent COVID-related packages in context, not so much. And the fourth package there, 52.3% reduction in child poverty, 55.1% reduction in deep poverty, increase in employment, and a slightly higher cost. So these were the things that we highlighted in the report. Next slide. And two important kind of conclusions that we came from all the simulations we did. First of all, there's not a single policy or program change that we could focus on that achieved the desired report. So there wasn't one program or policy that would get where we were charged with getting, but bundling work-oriented policies and programs with income support programs, whether those were means tested or universal supports in the different versions that we ran, could have the result of achieving substantial, like 50% reductions in child poverty and also increasing employment. And the interesting thing then that happened, because remember, we were doing our work in 2019, and we were not prescient enough to know that we were about to be part of a global pandemic, but based on the work that we were able to do, we did have the experience then when Congress was looking at pandemic relief and ways to respond to that. A number of the measures that we had highlighted became part of federal law and became part particularly of the American Rescue Plan and some of the other pandemic-related relief acts that were embraced by the Congress, and the Congress in talking about those various issues did cite the National Academy report as bringing a significant amount of evidence-based information at a time when it became all of a sudden very, very relevant and actionable by the Congress. So that was an interesting experience, but I think we learned from that you really have to look at the evidence and put together a package of things if you're going to have the desired result. Now, Claire then will highlight some of that evidence.
Yeah, why, yes, we will. And I do want to also, I think, just add here, Dawn, to the important points that you just made, is that in child welfare, and I will own this for myself, I think, in child welfare, we rarely engage in a policy dialogue about these kinds of policies. We tend to focus on our child welfare policies, but I think what you'll see, not just here about reducing dramatically child poverty, but I think in the rest of the evidence, you'll see that by engaging in these kinds of policy discussions, you're also engaging in a child abuse and neglect prevention policy discussion and a policy discussion about child welfare. Rarely do we think about it that way. And also, I think what we also see is that for those who administer these programs, rarely do they think about administering those programs or their policies explicitly as prevention of the more intrusive government deployment of child protective services. So I guess I would pause here and say, thinking about policy and the policy dialogues in which to engage, and the policy dialogues in which your partners or the broader social safety public benefit partners can be engaged in is important to think through carefully. So as Dawn indicated, we're going to talk about evidence and what the evidence shows about public benefits and more broadly economic and concrete supports, and their correlations, associations with involvement with child welfare and child maltreatment. I do want to caveat by saying that there are a variety of different kinds of studies here. They are not all equal. There are only a very few number of randomized controlled trials that can help us understand causality. There are also associative or correlational studies, natural experiment studies, where one state takes up a policy and one state does not, and we look downstream in administrative data. So I just want to be very clear that there are different kinds of evidence here, but the evidence is growing. And it is a growing preponderance of evidence that can help inform what has been effective and perhaps why. And it can inform our hypotheses about potential policy shifts and new pathways for supporting families. So first, we're going to just talk a little bit about what happens, what the evidence suggests happens when we remove or economic and concrete supports are reduced in the lives of the families. We really talk about that either. We are looking for, the positive effects, but I think the negative effects can tell us a lot. And here we offer a number of studies that suggest that when a variety of different kinds of economic or concrete shocks or removals from the lives of families occur, we see increased risk for child welfare involvement, including TANF, childcare, stable housing, reduced employment, which we saw a few minutes ago in some of the slides we've already seen, increased gas prices, interesting little modeling study, and reduced income and negative shocks. So I'm going to talk just about a few of them, not all of them. We don't have enough time, which I guess is both the good news and the bad news. There's a lot of evidence. Let's talk about TANF. And first, let's just remind everyone that the first statutory goal of TANF is to support needy families so that children can remain safely at home or with relatives. Again, the extent to which we administer this program, thinking about downstream effects in child welfare and whether or not TANF has sufficiently been administered to avert a child not staying safely at home, is not typically part of our dialogue. But this is a very interesting study that shows that states that implemented TANF sanctions of loss of all benefits for not working, we see increases in substantiated neglect reports, increases in foster care entries due to neglect, and increases in total foster care entries approaching 13%. Lack of access to childcare. For every additional childcare concern reported by a family receiving TANF, the risk of supervisory child neglect increases by 20%. This next is really interesting when we think about the theory about do we target services that address the proximal thing, the substance abuse, and or do we marry that with economic and concrete supports? And this is a very interesting study in that regard. Mothers who were entering substance abuse treatment who had difficulty securing childcare self-reported 82% more likely child neglect. And difficulty finding childcare was a stronger predictor of maternal neglect than almost any other factor in this study, including mental health and severity of drug use. We see a number of housing-related associations. Households that experience foreclosure filing in the next 6 to 12 months are at 70% greater risk of a CPS investigations than households that will not. Increases in mortgage delinquency and foreclosure rates are associated with increases in hospital admissions for physical abuse of children under the age of 6 and traumatic brain injury for infants under the age of 1. Lower family income is also associated with longer time to reunify if a child has been removed from a home. So children in foster care take longer to reunify with their families when the reason for placement is neglect. Their mothers have a lower average monthly income. And this is the removal. If the mother loses a significant amount of cash assistance post-placement. And speaking of policies, I think there's just a new piece of policy introduced in California to eliminate this practice. So when mothers are required to pay for the state costs of foster care, we see a $100 increase in the monthly child support order. It's predicted to increase the time of reunification by 6.6 months. So let's talk a little bit about macroeconomic factors and the relationship with child welfare involvement. And the reason why we think that public health approaches, more macro level population approaches are important to think about. Maternal hardship, again, what are we targeting? Material hardship is associated with CPS involvement beyond caregiver psychological distress and parenting factors. Economic factors are associated with neglect outcomes above parent behaviors and capacities. Higher income inequality is associated with higher maltreatment rates. And so at the county level, higher income inequality, independent of child poverty, is significantly associated with higher rates of substantiated maltreatment. Higher intergenerational income mobility is associated with lower maltreatment rates. So counties where a child has a greater chance of moving up the income ladder have lower child maltreatment report rates. This is an interesting study. This is a randomized controlled trial of Family Connects, which is a home visiting program where a nurse visits, but for 1 to 3 visits. And there is an assessment of material needs, and the nurse connects families to community resources in addition to providing education and any intervention that's needed. And this study found population level reductions in CPS investigations through age 5, almost a 40% reduction in investigations. So thinking about how we come at this from a population level is really important. This study also helps us understand that. This is a Hank Pohl's study that was in pediatrics in November that looked at state spending on public benefits, and the box on the right shows you what was taken into account in the model. Each additional $1,000 that states spend annually on public benefit programs per person living in poverty is associated with small but reductions in child maltreatment reports and substantiations and foster care placements, and almost an 8% reduction in child fatalities due to maltreatment. And so if that investment is made, it would be about a 13% increase in the dollar amount. We see that that would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $46 billion. We would see about 180,000 fewer maltreatment reports, a little more than 28,000 fewer substantiations, about 4,000 fewer foster care placements, and 130 fewer child fatalities due to maltreatment. But we would also see a long-term return on that fiscal investment due to reduced maltreatment related costs. We do see, as I mentioned at the top of this presentation, really important organizations calling for the provision of economic and concrete supports as a prevention strategy. The American Academy of Pediatrics in its Reimagining Child Welfare, called for building on the goals of Family First by expanding the scope of services eligible for federal reimbursement to include time-limited cash assistance to help low-income families meet concrete needs and minimize poverty-related neglect cases. And the CDC back in 2016 in its technical package for prevention included the need for evidence-based strategies to help prevent child abuse and neglect, to include strengthening economic supports to families. And policies are needed that improve the socioeconomic conditions of families to have the largest impacts on health. So if you've got questions or want to engage further with the content, our contact information is here. And again, the slide deck, I think the link has been put into the chat. And Dawn, before we turn it over for questions and answers, I just want to see if you've got any additional thoughts to add to the discussion.
No, I think, so first of all, thanks for Claire for putting it together an awful lot of very complex evidence in a digestible package. I'm familiar with some of that evidence and I know what a challenge that can be, but no, I look forward to questions or discussion.
Terrific. And a reminder, this is part one of a two-part series. So we'll come back at you next week with some additional information and additional evidence. So I think we're going to turn it over to CDSS and our organizers to add any of their thoughts and then open it up for questions and answers.
Thank you, Claire and Dawn. Yes, this is Franny Desai. I'm from the Office of Child Abuse Prevention. So I'm just going to start out with a few questions that we did get in our Q&A chat box. Great questions. So the first one is, an entirely new kind of parenting education that reaches everyone, everywhere, could be a powerful form of primary prevention. Should public health agencies and organizations be developing this new kind of parenting education?
So I think this randomized control trial is really interesting. It is, in these counties, universal parent engagement strategy that provides education at birth, as well as connecting family, assessing for economic and concrete support needs, and connecting families to resources. And I think the evidence would suggest that something that is universal, that is provided early, and that includes the understanding of a family's socioeconomic and context and needs, and connects them to a broader array of supports that include, but are not limited to, economic and concrete supports, could be quite beneficial.
Thank you, Claire. Another question we have is, President Biden's American Rescue Plan Act with the child tax credit and subsidies seem to be correlated with the decline in child abuse substantiations. One, is anyone studying this to gain evidence and advance the theories you're presenting? And two, if these policies have proven to be successful, what is the dynamic that has led to these programs not being continued? And I actually had the same question.
Okay, there's a lot in that question. We will bring, yes, people are looking at this, absolutely. Dr. Sege had a really interesting piece recently, and we have a slide showing the reductions in abusive head trauma. Child deaths due to maltreatment went down about 4.4%, though deaths of Black children went up about 17% during the pandemic. And we also see some really interesting effects as it relates to reductions of mental health challenges at the time that those economic infusions went into the pockets of individuals and families. So we see depression and anxiety being reduced at those points. And I think that it'll be interesting to see over time as researchers are looking specifically at those time points relative to changes, if at all, in reductions of abuse and neglect. I think it will be some time before we have a full picture, but our beginning picture suggests that abuse and neglect did go down during the pandemic. We also see in the set of policies in President Biden's package, policies that would increase childcare, the child tax credit, and we see ample evidence here to suggest that those would have an effect on child abuse and neglect and involvement with child welfare. I actually have a piece in draft talking about the child care portion of those policies specifically and the potential impact that we think that it might have. So I think it's important so back to the slide that Dawn had here and I interjected on in the National Academy. It's important for us to begin to think about these policies not solely as policies designed to address the most proximal thing. SNAP is designed to prevent or reduce food insecurity. TANF is designed to increase self-sufficiency and reduce income instability. But we see in the evidence these associations downstream with child welfare involvement. And so I think to the part of the question about why are those policies not passed, those are very complicated answers. One potential thing that we might do differently is begin to articulate how those policies also relate to the potential to reduce child abuse and neglect and foster care. And we don't currently talk about them in that way. We don't understand them in that way. And I think the evidence would suggest that we should.
Yeah, I'll add just a couple of things in the policy options that we looked at in the National Academy study. We looked at two things related to child care policy. First of all, was what if you took the child independent care tax credit and converted it to a fully refundable tax credit and concentrated the benefits on families with the lowest incomes and children under the age of 5. So that was kind of one approach that we looked at. And another approach we looked at was what if you guaranteed CCDF for all eligible families with incomes below 150% of the poverty line. In each of those, we found the reductions in child poverty, if you did only those things, were pretty modest. But if you paired those with other approaches, then you could get a more profound effect. The other thoughts, when we think about childcare policy, first of all, let's recognize childcare is incredibly expensive. And if we're going to do a good job of providing quality childcare, there are quality dimensions to that we sometimes don't focus enough on. So point one. And point two, currently we often put childcare in competition with other needs. So for example, states can transfer up to 10% of the TANF block grant to the Child Care and Development Fund. And so, yes, you can do one or the other, but not both. So there, with a finite resource, it is, sometimes you have to say, well, which is going to get the most significant impact one way or the other. But I think, as Claire said, there's a lot of work going on in those areas. But clearly, if you're going to have a strategy that is oriented to work and you don't have robust childcare, you're going to fail.
Absolutely. And a reminder, go back to the history lesson for a minute, that I had to learn myself again recently. Childcare is a critical resource, particularly if we're going to tie benefits to work. And in the early 70s, we had the Comprehensive Child Development Act that was passed on a bipartisan basis by Congress and then vetoed by the president. And it would have provided universal 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week childcare. And we didn't get that policy. And instead, one could argue that this time frame was sort of this choice point, because what we did get was the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act at about the same time. So again, this sort of choosing between something that is going to resource families robustly or something that is going to target specific behaviors that seem to relate to child abuse and neglect or child safety, and this bifurcation or this selecting of one over the other. So it's just a reminder that, Don, when you say that childcare is really expensive, it is, but in the early 70s, we came very close to having a universal childcare policy. So it is possible. The other thing that happens, I think, when we attach a work requirement to a policy, there are very good reasons for doing that. And yet, I think that many of the times that happens, it's because we worry that if we provide a benefit, the families are going to spend it on something that is untoward. But we see in the data, particularly coming out of the pandemic and other tests of universal basic income, the families, particularly low-income families, spend those dollars on stabilizing the household, on education for kids, on food and concrete needs, and very little of it is spent on things like alcohol and tobacco. So it's a complex picture, and I think having a full understanding of the policy context as well as the evidence is important.
Yeah, and I should also add that while providing childcare is very expensive, not providing childcare is also very expensive.
Extraordinarily so.
Yeah.
Thank you. One question, Claire, I'm looking at your list here, and one of the things that isn't on this list is gender, the same list that you just have.
Oh.
You just have on screen.
I'll put it back up. Hold on a second, friend. Yep, so this is the National Academy of Sciences work from 2019.
So gender equity in pay and equality in pay, does that also have an impact on, if we did pass legislation that looked like that, how would that impact reduction in poverty? I don't know if we have the studies.
I don't recall that we looked specifically at that. I know that some of the things we wanted to look at, not gender equity, but for example, we wanted to look very closely at some particularly vulnerable populations, Native American populations, et cetera. And we ran into a problem of just a lack of usable data to drive us. But I don't think we looked specifically at gender equity, but I'll kind of review our report, and if we've got anything to add there, I'll bring that to the discussion next week.
Thank you, Don. So that we have several questions both in the chat and Q&A. So I'll start with the two Q&A questions here. Were the difficulties in being able to report neglect and abuse during the pandemic taken into account in the data about rates of abuse and neglect during the pandemic?
Yeah, I'll start with that one, Don, and you can follow on. And Yasmin, could you drop into the chat the COVID brief from Dr. Weiner et al. From Chapin Hall? So certainly, yes, many people have yes, people are looking at the drop in reports and trying to understand that quite deeply. Early in the pandemic, as reports were dropping precipitously, we at Chapin Hall did an analysis and came to understand that drop as relatively consistent with the seasonal drops that we see every year when kids leave school for the summer. And show that visually on the in a graph in the brief that Yasmin has dropped the link in the chat. Thank you very much. We anticipated, and I think we're seeing in some states that reports come back up to a kind of a school year baseline over time. We also are doing a presentation in 2 weeks at the Child Welfare League of America with the state of Kentucky, and they too, like many states, saw the rates drop. But as kids have gone back to school, they've not seen an increase in substantiations, as if there was a backlog of abuse and neglect that we were not seeing because kids were not in school.
Another question, we need to link the policies with the associated cost benefits to every state. Has anyone calculated associated the costs to social services, the courts, the schools?
In our, oh, go ahead, Don.
Yeah, we didn't do it as granular as every state, but in our report, we did look at some of the, how much does child poverty cost us as a nation? So we did look at some of that kind of information, but the kind of granular, cost benefit state by state, I don't know. We didn't look at that as granular. I have been involved in some of those kinds of attempts at cost benefit analysis, and I would say they are not for the faint of heart.
I know that Safe and Sound here in San Francisco does some work on economics of child abuse. So I know that they have data from county to county, so we can definitely put that in the chat for folks if they're interested. So now I'm going to turn over to the chat. We have quite a few questions here as well. So just such a wonderfully informative presentation. I'm curious what the main reason or reasons are for folks and families returning to poverty within 5 years.
I don't have an answer for that question specifically. Don, did you all look at this turbulence moment, this in and out?
Not specifically. I mean, I've seen other work on that, and there. So I say a couple of things. First of all, depth of poverty matters, and persistence of poverty matters.
And in and out of poverty matters.
And if you, the deeper and more persistently you are in poverty, the more difficult it is to exit poverty. And the more. The deeper and more persistent poverty is associated with negative outcomes for children. I mean, that it's almost like, well, duh, that's pretty understandable. But I think that the key thing there is I think depth and persistence is important. We also there is a body of work, and we referenced some of it, and we did a chapter in the report on contextual issues. And one of the important contextual issues is the issue of place, that physical location can be a very powerful thing, and people who move or relocate from places of high poverty to less, there's some resilience associated with that.
Yeah, and I'm trying to go back to the slide that Dr. Bullinger used Dr. Chetty's.
Yeah, and Ray Chetty's work was one of the things that we looked at a lot.
Yep. Brenny?
So Patty, there's a question here. It said, did it go down or was it simply reported less often? If you wouldn't mind just expanding on that question in the chat, and then I can get back to it, because I'm not sure exactly what it was referencing. So I'm going to go to the next question, and then Patty, I'll go back to yours. If you could expand on that, that would be helpful. So the next question is, have there been studies that focused on rural areas for economic and child abuse and neglect rates?
Yes. There's a study on a southern state that my colleague at the time, Richard Epstein, did that looked at rural versus urban, but I don't remember the finding off the top of my head, and I will go back and pull that study. Don?
Yeah, I'm not. I think that the short answer is I'm sure there are, but I do know that first of all, I think that more populated areas, more urban areas, are more studied than rural areas. Areas that are close to major universities are also more studied. If you happen to live in Detroit, the likelihood that the University of Michigan has taken a look at your circumstances is pretty high. So some of that is part of it. And the other problem you get with rural areas is just the data accumulation is a little more daunting. But as Claire said, we can take a look at that and see what we can bring back to the discussion.
You, Don. You mentioned Dr. Robert, I apologize, I'm going to mess up the last name, Segi. Do you know if child welfare and other child serving agencies are open to adding PCEs or HOPE to intakes and or policies?
I think child welfare is in this very interesting moment where it's interested in many things that it was not previously. I think Family First has created a policy context and that has states working to create community pathways for Family First prevention services. On other platforms, the California Prevention Plan articulates that as a strategy. And we see about 14 or so states, at least across the country, also interested in community pathways, i.e. creating ways in which partner organizations can identify families with significant risk factors and working together with child welfare to leverage Family First prevention services to get those to families early in settings that are more family friendly and more attuned to a strengths-based approach. So yes, I think that there's an openness and an interest. Many states are also involved in things like Thriving Families, Safer Children that are trying to determine how best to move its resources upstream into communities in ways that are strengthening and supportive, and redesigning the front end of child welfare and redesigning the family user experience. So I think the answer is yes, though I think what we'll see over the next 5 to 10 years is going to be very interesting. Don?
Yeah, I'll just add that, and I think something we'll talk a little bit more about next week. But I think that if we think about Family First and the opportunities that it provides as a way to take what we do today and just throw this new layer on it, we're going to fail. That this really needs to be an opportunity to rethink and to say, okay, how, let's don't be wedded to all of the ways that we've done things in the past and now add an extra kind of adjacent set of requirements. But how can we rethink how we approach our work to families, and how can we use these new tools, imperfect though they may be, to really take a new approach to our work with families to strengthen families and to avoid some of the issues that got us to where we are today.
Thank you, Dawn and Claire. That's absolutely agree. We have a lot of potential moving forward. Is anyone looking at racism effects on these economic changes? Will they help whites more than people of color since they are not looking at racism?
Yeah. So we are going back to many of these studies and trying to understand the extent to which they looked at specific effects across racial groups to try and answer that question. And we also are interested in the extent to which additional spending would reduce disproportionality. So I think that that is a very interesting research question, and I think many of us are trying to answer that question.
And I think, and Claire, it may have been your work, but I think I just recently saw Casey Family Programs put out a summary where they went and looked at all of the programs on the clearinghouse and all of the studies that were the prevention clearinghouse and the extent to which those studies looked at racial and ethnic subgroups.
Yep, that's right. I'd encourage everybody to take a look at that. We also that was a Casey Family Programs document. We also separately looked at interventions that were designed by and for specific cultural groups or families of color that are in the pipeline that seem to be approaching the evidence standard that we would encourage people to then encourage the clearinghouse to review. So those are complementary, they're not the same, but complementary looks at individually targeted interventions that have potential for reducing disproportionality and increasing family stability and well-being. Thanks for that reminder. I hadn't forgotten about that.
How are you trying to correct the fact of lack of data on Native Americans?
Well, first of all, I think a couple of things there. First of all, there are a relatively small number of Indian tribes and Alaskan Native villages that have been approved for Title IV-E directly, and under the Family First Prevention Services Act, they can use culturally appropriate strategies, prevention strategies, outside of the clearinghouse construct. In other words, the tribe can determine that something has merit and is culturally appropriate, and there are a number of tribes that are doing that. There's also in the President's 2023 budget, there is a proposal to extend that capability to tribes who have state tribal agreements, as well as tribals that are tribal entities that have direct 4E. The broader data gathering issues related to tribes, that's a very difficult issue because of data collection issues. But I think, it may be that once we get further into the prevention data collection, that there'll be some improvement there. But I know that there are people who are working on that, and some Native American organizations are looking at that. But I don't, it's a very difficult thing just because of how diverse tribal organizations are.
And, rebuilding the trust also within our agencies to get that data from our communities that are marginalized. Yeah,
and I think I would point to the presentation last week by the Burns Institute to understand where some of that comes from.
Absolutely. And so I think this is a great closing question for everyone, but aside from our own individualized takeaways, what do you hope that we would take away from this presentation?
Claire?
Don, I think you actually said it quite well a minute ago, and I'll add to that, which is that understanding the policy framework, using what we know today and what we've been doing for the last 50 years, if we just overlay new things on top of that, that we might not really make as substantial a difference for kids and families as we might otherwise. So that thinking about family first or other policies in the broader context is important. And that when we think about child welfare policies, that we think not just about our child welfare policies, ASFA, CAPTA, family first, but that we think more broadly about the full set of family support and family and child and family well-being policies across the country, that those are very much prevention policies, and that we can't just be us talking about those policies as well. We have to help people. We have to help the broader community and our legislators and Congress understand that the decisions they make about those policies are associated with what we talk about and undertake every day.
I think also, and I think the challenge is that I think you in California are well positioned to do that, because first of all, and I know it may not seem like it, but you have a more positive resource environment than exists in many places, number one. Secondly, I think a lot of the innovative things that we see happening around the country are happening at the county level, where county officials and county stakeholders and providers and people with interest are coming around a common table, not just related to child welfare, but looking more broadly at the array of programs. And I think doing that at a state level is sometimes very daunting, and doing it sometimes operationally at a county level has some real advantages. So I think you have the opportunity to help us see the best way to do some of those things, and to then share those lessons with others and with each other.
Thank you, Claire and Don. Now we've come to the end of our 1.5 hour session. I know that we have a couple other questions in the chat, and what we can do is definitely get back to those questions in our upcoming sessions. We'll keep track of those. And essentially, what we'll do is we will send out the recording. We will send out the slide deck, hopefully to all our registrants by the end of the week, by Friday, so that everybody has an opportunity to see this again if they would like. And we look forward to seeing all of you hopefully next week again on Wednesday the 20th from 11 a.m. to 12:30. That will be part 2 of this discussion. And so we're looking forward to seeing all of you again, and thank you for your participation, and thank you so very much, Don and Claire, for your.
Right, thank you.
It's a pleasure, quite an honor. Take care.
Thank you.